President Biden's infrastructure plan is already facing opposition from Republican lawmakers. There's no sign of bipartisan support appearing soon. Here's Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell in Kentucky Thursday.
With a combination of massive tax increases on businesses and individuals and more borrowing to add even more to the $2 trillion national debt, I think that's a big mistake. And I think that package that they're putting together now, as much as we would like to address infrastructure, is not going to get support from our side. And I'm going to fight them every step of the way because I think this is the wrong prescription for America.
Republican concerns about the size of the government's budget are reemerging after years of rising national debt. Under President Trump, the deficit grew about $7.8 trillion. That's the gap between what the federal government spends and what it brings in. Add up each year's deficit and you get the national debt. Before the pandemic in 2019, the debt relative to the size of the U.S. economy was the highest it had been since 1946. That despite a 2016 Trump campaign promise to pay it all off. Russ Vought was the director of the Office of Management and Budget during President Trump's last 2 years in the White House, and he now runs the Center for American Restoration, a conservative policy group that describes its mission this way, to quote, restore an American consensus of a nation under God. Russ, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us.
You bet. Thank you.
Russ, welcome. You're opposed to this proposal from the Biden administration. And before I get to your reasoning, I want to play a clip from CBSN's interview with a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors, Heather Boucher, defending the plan this afternoon.
Folks want us to be investing in our nation's infrastructure. They understand we don't have safe water, when our schools aren't crumbling, when we don't have enough childcare centers, when we aren't making the investments to make sure that we are the leader in the kinds of electric vehicles that are going to be the cars of the future. People understand that these are the kinds of investments that our government needs to make. I do want to stress it is paid for, and it does put in place a tax system that will be more fair and that will really focus on rewarding the kinds of activities that are going to grow our economy over the long term.
Russ, what's your response to that, and how does it fit into your opposition of this plan?
Well, to the extent that this administration would be interested in doing an actual infrastructure bill, we would be supportive of that. I would be supportive of that. But this bill only has about $160 billion in real infrastructure spending for roads, bridges, airports, ports. And there's just a lot of other stuff that's wasteful. $174 billion for electrical vehicles, spending money to replace yellow school buses across the country. And it doesn't pay for it. The pay for it that it has in the bill is a massive tax increase on businesses going from 21% to 28%. And it does it after over 15 years, after spending 8 years of spending. And then the assumption is that that spending is going to just go away. And I don't think that's going to happen.
So let me ask you, because, there'll be people watching and who will note that under President Trump, there was a major increase in the national debt. They saw that rise after the tax cut. And now the Biden administration, of course, wants to raise taxes to spend money on infrastructure, childcare, and education. First of all, Russ, tell us why you think one is better than the other. And what do you say to those critics who argue that Republicans largely abandoned this notion of fiscal conservatism during the Trump presidency?
Well, I reject it. And I think one of the things you have to understand is that we were trying to get the economy growing. And you can't address spending if the economy is not growing. And so one of the priorities the last President Trump had was to get a major tax increase in place that was going to be paid for over the course of a 10-year period. And we had a comprehensive budget proposal that had $4 trillion in savings that would have allowed us to get ourselves back on the road to balance over 15 years. People on the Hill rejected that. We were able to get the tax increase, the tax cut into law, and that was what led to the enormous boom that you saw under the last president. And unfortunately, we were then given a pandemic and an economic shock that required significant resources. I think on a bipartisan basis, I supported that because I think that's what's necessary in a situation like that. You got to throw everything you got at a problem like that But now we're getting out of we're moving towards a recovery, and we've got to be careful about what we're spending money on. And I think there could be a room for an infrastructure bill, but not a $2 trillion bill that has 7% for what most people think of as infrastructure.
Do you think, Russ, though, this is just an opening position? Is there, you think, within this large plan, places where you see promise of compromise?
Well, I don't thus far, and it's because if you're looking at what's being said, Democrats in the House, AOC and others are saying they want a $10 trillion bill. So they're starting a bidding war and going in the wrong direction. Now, it will come down to the fact that there are a handful of House Democrats that are already saying that they're opposed to this. If that turns into double digits, they've got a real problem on their hands from the standpoint of getting this out of the House. And then, of course, with the current Senate the way it is, with Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin so critical to their being able to use a reconciliation process, I think there is substantial opportunity to get a better bill. But I think that the challenge is that this bill is so bad that even if some compromises are made to be able to get one or two senators, it's still going to be moving substantially in the wrong direction.
So the White House, to fund these plans, wants to raise taxes on households making more than $400,000 a year, and by increasing the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. That is still lower than it was before the 2017 tax cut. President Biden did not start at $10 trillion. So where things stand right now, I wonder, folks may be wondering, there are issues regarding infrastructure all across the country. How do you go ahead and move forward on this if it doesn't appear that there's anything at all that may be on the table right now to compromise on?
Well, I think the challenge is that on a bipartisan basis, the Democrats have not been willing to compromise. And what we would find in the last administration is that we would go in to negotiate with Democrats, and they would insist that the only way that they were going to agree on a bipartisan basis to an infrastructure bill is if the president said, I'm willing to overturn my tax cuts from 2017 and raise taxes. And that just was unacceptable. And here we go again. Instead of actually reaching across the aisle after a partisan exercise with regard to the so-called stimulus and saying, where can we find common ground? Instead, they start the bidding war at $2 trillion with all sorts of radical new government programs that have nothing to do with this. It's hard to then proceed on the basis of good faith.
All right, well, let me ask you this. Last February, when coronavirus was spreading across the globe but had yet to fully hit the U.S., you predicted the economy would grow at a usual 3% and that, quote, coronavirus is not something that is going to have ripple effects. Looking back at it now, Russ, is there anything that you would have approached differently in the Trump administration?
No, look, of course, you make those kinds of predictions when you don't have the full scope of information at your disposal. And so knowing what we now know, there are certain, we wrote a budget based on a pre-pandemic set of assumptions, but we approached the crisis at every juncture as if resources was not going to be something that would stand in our way. From day one, we amended our budget. We made sure that everything was required to fight the COVID-19, and we were willing to work on a bipartisan basis. And the challenge with that is that you really couldn't know on the front end all of the things that you were going to need, because even as you go through a single day, your resource needs would change. And we had a good bipartisan working relationship with Democrats in the midst of that crisis to make sure that the whole thing was fully funded.
Do you think that the increased level of national debt put the United States, though, in a weaker position heading into the pandemic?
Can you imagine if we had not had the tax cuts and we had not had the economic boom that the President Trump put into place, and then we went into an economic shock of that magnitude? It would have been a significant problem. And I think the reason why we have such a shot at a V-shaped recovery is because of the fact that the economy was so strong, it then hit a shock, and then it's getting out of that trajectory and moving in the right direction until the Biden administration and its anti-growth policies are now in effect. And so that is what the nation is now dealing with. And I do not think that our ability to get a tax cut done was going to hurt the fiscal health of this country. I don't believe that.
And right now, though, where do you see things as they stand before the infrastructure plan that President Biden would like to see implemented? Where do you see the nation's fiscal health?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a rough situation. We just passed a $2 trillion stimulus bill. It was not a stimulus bill. We have a $28 trillion national debt that we have, and we has on every year the president's budgets would put forward trillions of dollars in spending because we are the ones that were saying we have a problem. We're not saying that we don't need to address the deficit and debt. Far from it. And so, I feel the same way that I did the last 4 years as I do today, that we've got to get a handle from a fiscal responsibility standpoint and get after it.
And for fiscal conservatives, Russ, finally, as we wrap up here, for fiscal conservatives who are disappointed to see the level of spending and the increase in the national debt during the Trump administration, especially after President Trump had campaigned on paying that down during his tenure, what do you say to those fiscal conservatives?
Well, I am one, and I would say that the president complied with his promise. He put forth and had campaigned to put forward a plan to do it. It's not his fault that the Democrats and Republicans on the Hill said, we're not going to approve your spending reductions. And so then the president took an orderly approach to how he was going to fight on behalf of the American people, get the economy going, get our security in order with increases for defense, protect the wins when the Democrats took control of the majority so they couldn't stop the wall and roll back our regulatory agenda, which was a part of keeping the economy going. So all of those things were important. And we were in the process of being able to get to our spending fight, and we ran out of time. But it's something that we were standing on behalf of, and we are to this day.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time. Russ Vought. Russ, thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.